All right, so I'll begin recording. Hi, welcome. Um, as Leslie said, my name
Ora un minute per
Lauren.
salirne.
As Leslie said, my name is Lauren Maclean. I'm the Assistant Director of Multilingual Education for Democracy Prep Public Schools, and I'm excited to talk to you all today about vocabulary instruction. All right. And so we really have one objective for today, which is how to differentiate vocabulary instruction to best support English language learners. And on this slide, I have a picture of the Wonder Wheel from Coney Island, because to me, that's really where my story with learning how to teach vocabulary starts. So prior to teaching in Coney Island, which is where I first taught when I moved to New York, I was a high school Spanish teacher and a dual language Mandarin teacher. And in both of those roles, I had a pretty great advantage, which is I spoke both the languages that I needed in both roles. When I moved to Coney Island, I thought, great, I'll teach English as a new language to a bunch of students. Everybody else speaks Spanish or Chinese, or the two most spoken languages in the world. I'll be set. But as many of you probably knew better than I did, many of the English language learners in Coney Island are Russian speakers. I do not speak Russian. And so this is really where I realized, wait, I can't just tell a kid, oh, here's how you say this in your language, moving on. I really needed to teach kids how to make vocabulary stick for them, even if I might not be able to tell them, here's the word in your language. So I'm going to talk to you guys today about 3 tools that I use, and we're going to try some of them out. All right, and the first thing I do want to name too is why vocabulary. So multiple studies show that explicit vocabulary instruction is the highest leverage, one of the highest leverage methods of instruction for English learners, especially if you can't do a dual language or bilingual setting. So for many of us in New York who are in very diverse classrooms, that's the case. I've included some of the research below if you want to check it out. Also just name that while we talk about vocabulary from the perspective of the supportive English language learners, really every student in your class benefits from learning vocabulary. And we're going to be talking about the different types of vocabulary as well. And so now I think it's important for us to talk about how we scaffold vocabulary. And this is something that I think we all learned about in teacher education, but I like to think of a little differently for our English language learners. So a lot of times when I'm sitting in a school or talking with a school leader or a teacher, they'll talk about, I need my students to learn tier 3 vocabulary, or sometimes tier 2 vocabulary. And I think it's really important for us to consider with our English learners that we always need to start from tier 1 vocabulary. And many of us assume that all of our students, especially general education, know the tier 1 vocabulary, right? Those are the words that we think children learn on their own. But when you're looking at your students and you're seeing that they might be at an entering or an emerging level on the nicest lad or the nice tell, then those are students who are still acquiring that tier 1 vocabulary and need your support doing so. This is something that we often skip, but as the pyramid kind of shows, not as well, you need to be able to do all of them. So I suggest not using the pyramid and instead thinking of it as an upward flow chart. You have to have the tier 1, and then from there, you're able to build on the tier 2 vocabulary. The tier 2 vocabulary, I think, is often where we see many of our transitioning scholars need extra support, and our entering and emerging scholars need really explicit instruction. So our transitioning scholars might be able to use the context around these words, their tier 1 vocabulary they already have, but they need some extra tools. Then we get to tier 3 vocabulary, and tier 3 vocabulary is honestly where all of us, I think, are already more proficient, because these are words we know we have to teach all scholars, right? Our general education students need to learn what a revolution means mathematically the same way that our English language learners do. So what we're going to talk about today is tools to teach tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 vocabulary in ways that stick for our English language learners. And so to do this, we also have to consider how scholars first acquire new vocabulary based on the different modalities. And by modalities, I mean the speaking, listening, reading, and writing. And so I think often we think about our scholars first acquiring language receptively and then producing it expressively. So they're often learning how to listen and read, and then they're able to speak and write. However, the thing I have forced myself to learn in a great way is that this works differently for many students, especially students who might have interrupted education. And so, for scholars with some interruptions in their education, they may actually develop their listening and speaking before their reading and writing because they have that rich oral language, but they haven't had as much literacy training. So they're not having their skills in literacy in Spanish then translate into English. They're learning literacy to begin with. And so in those cases, often scholars are ready to produce language in speaking before they're ready to read it. And so it's just really important when you're looking at your students to figure out how to teach vocabulary and how you want them to use it to show mastery, that you're also looking specifically at what they're able to do.
Lauren, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm Monica Baker. I'm New York State TESOL president. Can you make me co-host so I can monitor if someone has their microphone open? I can just help with that. Thank you.
Sure. All right, sorry. Let me see how, if I can do that real quick. I do hear some. I can just make you the host, but I don't think I can make you a co-host. I'm sorry, my work has weird settings.
Oh, okay.
Let me see.
I don't need to control it. I just want to can everyone just make sure you're muted, because there's just background noise and then that affects, the recording and everything. So everyone just be aware of whether or not you're unmuted. Thank you so much. I'm sorry to interrupt, Lauren.
No problem. Sorry about that too. I'll try and monitor as well to see. Hopefully we can all stay muted. All right. So the first way that I think of teaching vocabulary is through total physical response. And if you're able to either show me with your hands, for those of you on video, either like thumbs up, thumbs in the middle, or thumbs down, how much you are aware of TPR, or in the chat, you can do a 1 through 5, 1 being I've never heard of this, and 5 being I use it all the time. Or you can use the icons in Zoom, as I'm seeing Susan do. You can just do that so I know how much everyone's familiar with it. Great. I see lots of people who are using TPR. Great. I think many of us are super familiar with it. And so just to be clear, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. Really, TPR is associating vocabulary with gestures, right? A lot of times we think of this with tier 1 vocabulary, but I think sometimes we limit ourselves that way, and we can really use it with tier 2 and tier 3 vocabulary as well. And so one of my favorite examples is using part, whole to teach something like addition. So you're not just looking at, run or sit. You're looking at really more formal language that scholars are going to use in their classroom. The other thing I often talk about with TPR is the importance of involving students in the co-creation of gestures. So when I think of revolution, my symbol may be like a fist. But if my students don't know what that means, that gesture isn't going to help them associate revolution with the actual meaning of the word. And so it's important for you, as you're acquiring the meaning with the students, to say, what gesture do you think represents this word? I will name, that's a little harder if you're working with very young students, but especially with older students, it's often helpful to make sure that they're involved in the co-creation. It will definitely stick better for them. And so now I have 2 questions, and I want to do just the first one first. So I want you all to think about a word that you are going to teach this week using TPR. And I'm seeing a lot of you use it a lot already. So you can just pick a word in one of your upcoming lessons that you're using and just put it in the chat so that we can all just get an idea of some of the richness of the vocabulary that we can access using TPR. Anybody going to be brave? Let's see. You can also come on mute quickly to say your word if that's more accessible for you. Ooh, growing, habitat, quarantine. I feel like we have a lot of science happening. Action words. How GA, I also tend to use TPR a lot for verbs. I think I've pushed myself to think about it with nouns as well. Now, let's time out there And now let's stop and think about a word that you don't know how to use TPR for. So I think oftentimes I'm like, TPR is great, it's magical. And then a teacher will say something like a word to me, and I'll be like, yeah, I don't know. And so I will go ahead and kick things off with an example. And I want to see just if anybody can brainstorm. Auto mechanics. Heidi's coming in. I was given the word quark, which is a physics term. It's like, I don't know. Text features. Right? Yeah, how do you do that? So let's stop and think about these for a little bit. So I think auto mechanics, you could at least consider doing some sort of like something with a car or maybe a wrench, right? Text features, maybe something with a book. Nonfiction, Monica, right? It's like, what's the difference between fiction and nonfiction? I made it an either or, but I haven't made it clear what it is, right? So I think TPR is a tool that we all love to use, but it doesn't work with every word. And so the next tool I'm going to talk about is one that I find works a little better with some of the abstract concept words, as Susan has really helpfully identified. And that's TPRS. If you can also show me with a thumbs up icon, kind of your familiarity with it, thumbs up, middle, or thumbs down. Seems like less familiar. This is always surprising to me. So TPRS, or Teaching Proficiency Through Reading and Storytelling, is a method of language acquisition that I think has largely lived in foreign language classrooms. And I learned it when I was doing my certification to be a high school Spanish teacher. It was started by Blaine Ray in the 1980s, and so you can do lots of research into it. But it's really focused on the idea of making input comprehensible for scholars. So when you're teaching new vocabulary, it's important to really make sure that students can internalize and understand the vocabulary before they're expected to express it. And there's 3 parts of a TPRS lesson. Now, do want to pause. A TPRS lesson, as I'm going to start calling this, is not like a 45-minute lesson that you are doing for your whole day. It's like 15 minutes of your class that you do to do vocabulary. And so the first part is always establishing meaning. Then you ask a story. We're going to talk about that a lot. And then you read and discuss, and that tends to lead into the rest of your lesson. This method of teaching vocabulary I find is really helpful for words that are related. So for example, nonfiction, fiction, and text features are words that I might consider doing as a TPRS lesson. And so the first part of a TPRS lesson is to establish meaning. And so you're introducing 3 to 5 new vocabulary words. Now, a lot of you have talked about some action words. I always say make sure you use a consistent verb conjugation when you're doing this, just to avoid confusion. Now, how you teach that can happen a lot of different ways. Maybe some of them you can use TPR. Maybe you're using visuals, so you're holding up a nonfiction book and saying like, this is nonfiction, this is a real person on the cover, and then here's a fiction book, it has a talking animal, right? Maybe you use native language translations here if you have that skill and you have that accessible, right? You're making sure scholars have a general idea of what the word is. But the next part is the fun part to me. And this is where you get to ask a story. And to do that, your scholars, I call them scholars because I work in charter school, so sorry, students, have some jobs. And the first one is a timekeeper. Your timekeeper is a student who struggles to stay on task. Maybe they're your highest student, maybe they're your lowest student, but they struggle to stay on task, so you want them to be watching a clock so they're paying attention. Your next student is going to be your artist. They're going to draw for you. This can really be any student, but some of your students maybe really like drawing. This is a good time for them to shine, especially if they're still a little shy about using language. You'll have some actors. These are your outgoing extroverts. You'll have a scorekeeper. Your scorekeeper is going to be your lowest student. And then you'll have the audience, which is the rest of the students. Now, when you ask a story, the scorekeeper's job is to tally how many times you use each vocabulary word. So let's say that you have fiction, nonfiction, and text features. They're going to write those 3 words down on a paper, or you might give it to them, and then they're going to tally each time you say one of them, And when you've said one of them 12 times, they're going to give you a thumbs up, so you know it's time to move on to the next word. But you're not just going to like repeat it over and over. You're going to do it through a story. And so to do that story and to make sure that you can say the word 12 to 15 times without it getting boring, you're going to go through different types of questions. And the first one is going to be a yes or no question. And you might even do a thumbs up and thumbs down to make sure your students understand. And it's going to be something like, was he reading a fiction book? Oh, I just went in either or. So I just say, was he reading a fiction book? Yes or no? My word is fiction. And I'm just looking for the students to say yes. Now, again, you're the director in this. So if the students all say no, which they will sometimes, you're the director. You get to direct the story. So you can stop and be like, that's not right. I think he was reading a fiction book. Was he reading a fiction book? Yes. And then you'll say, was it? And then you'll move into the either or question. So at that point, I might actually be able to use two words and say, was it a fiction book or a nonfiction book? And I'm looking for students to then actually start producing our vocabulary word fiction. Now, asking a student if a book is a fiction book or a nonfiction book does not help me know if they understand what a fiction book is. So at that point, I would try and do another either or question. And I might say, so it's a fiction book. Do fiction books have real people doing real things, or do they have make-believe things? And then I'll have the students choose make-believe things. And I'll say, yes, that's right. Fiction books have make-believe things, right? Then I'm going to move into my factual recall questions. Now, I'm going to be trying to make this fun, right? I'm not just trying to say the word fiction. So at this point, I'll probably be saying like, what is Billy's story about? And somebody will say, I'll get them to say that it's a talking animal because it's a fiction book. And I'll say, is that, so what is a fiction book again? And then they'll tell me it has make-believe characters. And I'll say, when did Billy know his book was a fiction book? When he got to the talking animal, right? Then I'm going to move into my higher level thinking question finally with that word, which is something to get at if the students understand the meaning. So if they tell me that Billy knew the book was a fiction book when it got to the talking duck, I will say, why did a talking duck mean that Billy was reading a fiction book? And I'm looking for a student to produce the fact that that's not a real thing and fiction books have not real things. Now, at this point, I know that I am sick of saying the word fiction, which means that I've probably said it about 8 times already. And so this is how you'll ask the story for your students. And don't worry, if you are like, I'm a little confused, we're going to do like 2 examples because this seems like a strategy that I have found really helps my students, but that not enough of us know how to do. Now, after you ask your story, which again, we'll go back to another example, there is another step, which is reading and discussing. This is where after you've asked and made up your crazy story, your scholars might then read a story that you've prepared using the words. And maybe that's actually the text you were going to read anyway. So maybe it's a paragraph that describes what a fiction book is and nonfiction book is and what text features are. Then you're going to have them demonstrate their comprehension of that, and they can do that a few ways. In most foreign language classrooms, we would have them do that by translating it into their native language. So I would give my students a story in Spanish and tell them to write it in English, because then I know they know all the words. If I am teaching a group of students who I know their native language and I am teaching English, I might still have them do that. And I do that now as a teacher. I give them a story in English and I say, please put this into French, right? But as we previously discussed, I don't speak Russian and many of my students did. So I knew that wasn't going to work for me. And so another thing I'll have my students do is draw what happened and then label it. And I will say you have to have 5 labels. 3 of those labels have to be these 1, 2, 3 vocabulary words that we've been working on to make sure they're able to identify where in the story they used those words, right? For my students with interrupted education, Yes, Loretta, I see your comment and I agree. Using Google Translate and then pairing that with a visual is another great way to do that. The other thing I'll do for my students with interrupted education is have the student just describe or record, because we're virtual right now, what happened orally in their own words, right? So I have a lot of students at this point who are very proficient speakers of English and a little more scared or hesitant writers. So I'll tell them, all right, record the story. Now, describing it orally for many of my students is step one. Step two is to listen to your own description and then start writing it down, because if you know the words, we just have to figure out how to spell them. But for some of my students who have very limited literacy, this can be really helpful. That also is helpful to do in your native language if you have students who don't have any literacy in their native language. The other thing we can do, if say we really want to have a lot of fun, or I'm sure that this is really like student energy is low that day, and granted this really only works in person, is we can act out our story. So we just told a story, now I'm giving you a new story and I'm saying you have to act it out for me. So that's where my actors come in, and I'll say, all right guys, but you have to tell them what to do. So I'll make sure the class is involved in that. And so now I want to just kind of go back, and I'm going to give you an example of how I do this in terms of questioning with a vocabulary word. So I now work at a school called Democracy Prep, and unsurprisingly, a lot of my students don't know the word democracy. And so I want to make sure that they do, or they know the word, but they don't really know what it means. And so this is one of the first words that I always do, because I think if you're going to tell people the name of something, you should know what it means. And so when I start doing democracy with my students, I always start and I like draw a nice picture, and I'm like, here is a boy. They'll usually name the boy after one of their classmates, because that makes it all the more fun for everyone. Or I will be the person in the story and die a horrible death. It's two options. But the first question will be like, where do they live? And they'll tell me, and maybe they'll say a country that's not a democracy. They might pick China. And I'll be like, no, that's not it. I don't think it's China. And I'll wait until they give me a country that's a democracy. And then I'll say, was their country a democracy? Yes or no? Then I start trying to establish meaning with my yes or no question. And I say, since it was a democracy, did the people vote? Yes or no? Right? Then I pretend that I have forgotten things and I say, wait, was France a democracy or a monarchy? I'll let them choose. France is a bad example because it was a monarchy at one point, never a democracy, but then I'll go into my either or, right? In a democracy, do the people choose or does the king choose, right? And so each time I'm both using the word, but I'm also trying to get more at the meaning, right? So then I go into some factual recall, some of which isn't related to the meaning of a democracy, right? I'm asking them, where is our democracy? That doesn't tell you anything about it, but it just builds that engagement, right? And then I'll ask, what is a democracy? Then I'll move into, how do we know, right? And then we go into something like, why did they want to be a democracy? This is a high school level word. And so I'm expecting my students at this point to even pull in some learning from outside of class and think about why countries become democracies. And then I might ask them how they became a democracy. In this case, my next word was actually revolution. And so I did this purposefully so I could lead into my next word. I go through my words one story pane at a time. And so this is usually what my board or my Nearpod right now looks like. And my first word goes in the first box. So that's where I'll be drawing what happens while we talk about democracy, or I'll have a student artist do it because I'm a terrible artist. My second word will really be about revolution, and then I'll be moving in. And again, because I have a timekeeper, because I have a scorekeeper, it really helps make sure that I can differentiate by level. But also I know that I'm expecting full participation, but I also might do some cold calls, especially on the yes or no or either or questions for some of my lower students. Build their feeling of success, right? They can answer that yes or no question, especially if I don't actually care the outcome of the yes or no question, because then they just automatically get it right. But even with the either or, right? Most kids know if I ask democracy, which is our word, or monarchy, the answer is going to be democracy. You build their success. So then when we get to the what is a democracy, they're ready to engage. And so will just say that I've really found this successful with my ELLs. And I think that if we're all able to kind of think through how to do a TPRS lesson with word groups, it also helps establish the meaning of words in families. So we're not just thinking of fiction as one action we do and nonfiction as another action and text features as another action like we would in TPR. We're thinking of I learned fiction, nonfiction, and text features today because those three words are all related. I'm not going to try and like teach three words that have no relation when I'm trying to do a story. And so now I want us to try a little waterfall, and I want us to just all think about some words that we could teach using TPRS, so using a story this week. And so I'm going to ask you to, I'm going to give you 30 seconds of my timer here to go ahead and type them in, but don't hit send yet. And then I'll tell you, and we can all hit send at the same time. All right, you have about 15 seconds. You just need 3 to 5 words. And if you don't know, it's okay to just put in maybe one word you want to try this with to get started. All right, ready, set, go ahead and hit send on your words. Table of content. Wow, so many fun ones. White supremacy, not a fun one, but important to teach. But I'm thinking like habitat, earth, and mammals, like what a great way to do a story. Colonial alliance independence, agreed. I tend to think that TPRS works especially well for history because you can also make your story be an actual historical event. So often my stories involve me or my students, and usually we are doing something that ends up getting us killed. This is quite a common theme. But if you're doing an actual historical story, you can direct it so that it really goes through what happens. Or similarly, if you're thinking of like science words, you can talk about a subject like deforestation in a way that's meaningful. Or as Seltels says, like you can think about how you can relate integration and segregation and how white supremacy has impacted and created segregation. So again, I really think TPRS is a lot of fun. There are a few limitations. And that's where I really go to graphic organizers. And the thing I go to graphic organizers for the most, which I think we all probably do, and I'm not even going to ask you if you know what a graphic organizer is because I know we all use them, is for tier 3 vocabulary, and especially for scholars with strong prior literacy. So I often also think of graphic organizers as something that this is a skill I am teaching my students. So TPRS is something that we're going to do together. You're not going to sit down to study for your exam or to write a paper and do TPRS with yourself. But graphic organizers are really about teaching you how you can be a better student. And so to do this, I'm thinking about how my students study, and my favorite way to use graphic organizers is when I'm thinking about words I need to teach my students that have multiple meanings. How do I teach them to create different graphic organizers that illustrate those different meanings? And so my favorite way to do it is using index cards. And I will often have my students draw their map on their index card. I've already taken notes on this one. But here, I'll have them draw it on here, right? Because I think a lot of times students hear index cards and they think word, definition. And I'm like, nope. You can put your word and then you can draw a little chart on the back so you make sure you understand everything about it. Now, these are the things that I tell students you can have. You can have a picture, a part of speech, the definition, and a native language translation or definition if that helps you. Especially with tier 3 vocabulary, these are words that all of our students are learning for the first time. So even if you have been having really great consistent education, you may not know this word in your native language, and that's okay. In that case, write down how you would describe it. What would your definition be in the language that's most accessible to you? And so my favorite example for this is revolution, because this is a word that confuses every single high school student, I think because it comes up on the regents for both math and history. I'm not actually sure which math regents it comes up on, but it seems like a lot of them. And so revolution really has two meanings. And if you don't know both of them, you're going to get very confused in one of your classes. And so the first index card that I'll have my students make is for revolution and what it means for when they're in math class, right? And in that case, I might actually use TPR as well. I might talk about how we're doing a revolution, right? To show that it rotates in a complete circle, right? I'll identify the part of speech for my students. I don't spend a lot of time on that, but I'll say this is a noun. What's a noun? Person, place, or thing. Yes, right? Revolution is a noun. How would we say it as a verb? It's revolve, right? That just gives me a little way to get a little bit of the word family in there. But then I'll have them write a definition, draw a picture, write a definition in their own language if they'd like to. Then I'll tell them it's time for another index card with a different color, right? So when we went virtual the first time, I sent my students home with different colors. We are still struggling to keep those up. So I will name, now I tell them sometimes like draw a star if it's for math, draw a heart if it's for history, right? Getting creative. And then I'll say, let's think of a different one, right? And so here I'll also go ahead, and if I'm doing this with students, I'll say, let's highlight some of the things that are the same. So revolution in history is still a noun, right? But it means something different. When we say that America had a revolution, we don't mean that America turned around in a circle. We mean that it was a movement to overthrow something, right? And so then instead, I'll have them think, what image would you pick for revolution? So I picked one on Google. Somebody else talked about how they like to use Google Images, especially when I'm virtually teaching. That's really easy, right? But I might also ask my students, like, what do you think of when you hear revolution? And if they go back to the circle, I'll say, all right, stop. We have to take our math hat off. We have to put our history hat on. And then I'll say, like, let's think about a revolution that you might have learned about. Currently in East Harlem, many of my students are Senegalese, which means they learned a lot of French history. So we often talk about the French Revolution, because I can talk about the American Revolution and sing my Hamilton songs all I want, but they didn't learn about the American Revolution. So they know the French Revolution, and that's where we go with. This also just goes to, you have to know your students and what they will respond to. Revolution was a really hard word for many of my students who are from China, because they don't talk about revolution in the same way in China, right? And so it's also about knowing the cultural context of your students. Who's going to immediately think revolution? And the first thing they think of is the historical word for it. Who might first think of the math term? And that's how you would do that. I am realizing now that I might actually finish this presentation early. I talked too fast on these. I'm going to apologize in advance. All right, so now I want to think about how you will begin using graphic organizers in your class, but I know a lot of you do. So what I want you to think instead is like not like how you're using them in class, but how you're going to train students to use them as a study tool, right? So not just here's something that we filled out as part of our do now, and now we're going on to the next thing. How are you going to do this, right? What word are you going to use first so that you can make sure it really sticks? A lot of you guys are teaching about some really cool things, right? And so if you're doing TPRS, right, as part of your establishing meaning with white supremacy, integration, and segregation, maybe you establish meaning by having kids fill out graphic organizers about those words, right? And so I want you guys to think about how you're also going to monitor scholar completion of graphic organizers, especially if you're virtual. I am just curious, honestly, because I think this is something that's really hard for a lot of us right now. So if anybody has ideas for monitoring scholar completion of graphic organizers, please unmute yourself or put them in the chat. I currently have my students hold them up to the screen so I can see them. But I'm not sure if anybody knows of any online tools where their students are completing graphic organizers as well. Integrating images, yep, definitely very important. Just there's no help. You use Seesaw and post them there. Thank you, Monica. I don't use Seesaw. Really should, I guess. I use Nearpod, which I just don't think works well for graphic organizers. So that's very helpful. Right. I also think graphic organizers are a great way to leverage parent engagement, right? So a lot of times we're thinking about like, how can we support parents with supporting their scholar learning, and saying to a parent, like, your child should have like 3 graphic organizers filled out, or should have this graphic organizer filled out before they start writing. If they're working on a high school paper, as one of my students is right now, I'll say, like, before your student starts writing on their Chromebook, like, ask them, did you fill out your graphic organizer, and make them explain to you all of the parts of it. Ooh, using small whiteboards for kindergartners. Yes. Oh, and great, Susan. Yes, I think graphic organizers can be so helpful for story elements, especially because you can also plot chronologically, which I think is something that in TPRS, because every TPRS lesson is chronological, if you're trying to teach chronological words, students don't always realize that. And so graphic organizers are a great time to bring that in and talk about, you know, this is Paleolithic and Neolithic, those types of words. All right. So I have finished 5 minutes early. So I am happy to take any questions that you all may have. And thank you all for coming. And I hope that you're able to use some of these tools in your class. And if you are, I would love to see them. Great, Heidi. And also, you guys have my email. If you need any resources, or you want, I have a 1-pager on how I set up my TPRS lessons virtually. I'm happy to share. I know a lot of us are in person now, but I work in high school in New York City, so not yet. Stacy, definitely, if you email me, I'll send it to you.
Yeah, and just to add, it will be on the YouTube channel as well, so please check that as well.
Lauren, I was going to ask, so you stick with 3 vocabulary words at a time. You don't go over 3. Is that kind of the magic number?
I go up to 5.
Oh, you do? Okay.
I don't go above 5. I suggest people start with 3, but I don't go above 5. And if you're doing it with like elementary schoolers, I would only do 3. They get overwhelmed if you try to do 2 words in 1 picture.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm not a fan of the kind of those old-fashioned vocabulary books that some of our middle schools still use, where it's like a list of 20 obscure words, and then the kids have to just like try to memorize those words that have no connections. So I've never heard of TPRS until today, so thank you for this. And I definitely think I love that it can engage students at all different levels. Like, you've got kids who, you know, are in the silent period, but they can clearly do thumbs up, thumbs down with no pressure. So I love that. And then you can make sure you're getting everyone engaged at their comfort level. So thank you.
Yeah. And Julia, I have 3 vocabulary graphic organizers that I like. I probably have more that I just haven't thought of this year. So if you shoot me an email, I'll send you the ones that I really like to use. I have a few, kind of depending. Also, if you tell me what grade level, because I have taught pre-K to 12. Using TPRS with kindergartners. This is fun. I did use it with my preschoolers. And I think it's definitely an adjustment. So I think there's a few things if you're going to use TPRS with younger grades. The first is setting really clear rules for engagement. So am I asking for everybody to say things at once, which actually in high school I usually am. I just want my students to be engaged, which is really hard virtually. So I'm like, just shout it out. Not with kindergartners. Oh, great. Thank you, Michelle. And so with kindergartners, I'll say like, when I do the yes or no, I want you to see yes or no. When I do either or, I'm going to say, is it one or is it two? And I'm going to say the words, but I'll have the one and the two up and I'll say, you have to show me on your hands. And then I'll say for the other questions, you have to raise your hand, because getting kindergartners to yell out is just not going to be a recipe for success. I'll also, again, I'll only use 3 words and probably only 3. And then at the end, I usually have them either act it out or they have to tell it back to me. I don't try and get them to write quite yet. We might be getting there, March, but not yet. And by writing in March, I mean like they're going to draw and label, and then we'll get one sentence. So yeah. How GA, I usually spend about 15 minutes doing vocabulary in a lesson. I think that often feels like a long time to people, and that's especially if I'm doing standalone ENL, I'll spend 15 minutes, but I really push language arts teachers to consider doing that as well. I also use my standalone ENL to pre-teach vocabulary for history and science and math. And so sometimes my whole lesson will be vocabulary, and we'll do like a really long TPRS lesson that'll lead into something. And so, yeah, it really does depend if it's standalone or integrated. Integrated 15 minutes, standalone ENL, I can really use as much time as I have. A special way to teach seasons, Julia. I've used TPR to teach seasons. I haven't tried doing it with TPRS. So I think I've had like summer where it's hot, and then fall with the leaves falling, and then snow. That's kind of how I've done it. In spring, things grow. And so I've really done it that way. But I would love to hear if anybody else has thought of it. But I find that TPR is really helpful. Sheeting, yes. So usually after vocabulary instruction, we go into either a reading, listening, speaking, or writing lesson. I try to vary the modalities, but usually I then go into like something that integrates the content more. So maybe it's a reading on the American Revolution to get them ready for what they're going to be doing in history class, where their teacher is going to honestly assume that they already know about the American Revolution. Or we might be watching a video about some of our science words to get ready for the next day in science class. So it kind of depends, but yes, it'll move into more of a standardized, like, let's all read together, and then we'll annotate the reading, or we'll stop the video and ask questions, that type of activity. And sometimes we'll go into novel study. I haven't done that in a while because I don't teach elementary currently, but also I'll do like my vocabulary lesson for 15 minutes, and then we'll open up Charlie and the Chocolate Factory or Esperanza Rising and dive right in, and then we'll be able to, oh, remember this word? How did they use it? Is that the same or different from our story?
Let's say you do a TPRS activity on a Monday, a lesson on a Monday. Then on Tuesday, do you do like a portion of it again with the same words to like reinforce what you did on Monday? Or is it kind of like a one-shot deal for that group of words?
It depends based on, so I use the retail that students do as my exit ticket essentially of that. And I use, if I'm doing novel study, the reading. And so I'll see like, do I think they got the words? And sometimes I'll be like, all right, guys, doesn't seem like we got the words yesterday. Let's try again. We need a new story. Like, let's start here. But usually I use TPRS like once a week, because I'm going to keep using those words all week. And so the next day we might watch a video, or when I taught preschool, we might sing a song. My high schoolers don't like to sing with me. Or we might do a reading, or I might have them come in and I might be like, let's see what you remember. Can you write me a story that uses our 3 words from yesterday? It can be the story we talked about, or it can be a different one. Too much TPRS, you lose the magic. Got to make it a special activity. I'll also say for high school teachers, I used to call my TPRS lessons, I didn't call them TPRS with kids, I call it story time. And that seems to get kids excited because it activates that like joy of elementary school, including I would sometimes set up my classroom. They would know it was a TPRS day where I would move the desk so they could sit in a circle like many of our kindergartners do. So can't do that with COVID right now, but I'm hopeful that eventually we'll be able to do that type of thing again, but also calling it story time just like brings some joy to it.
Okay, I just wonder if there's any more questions. Lauren, thank you so much for doing this for us. As usual, extremely practical, really, really helpful, and just a lot of great feedback from everybody. So thank you so much. And you can see Lauren's email if you want to email her anything. It will be on the YouTube channel, but also I please stress, go and have a look at the nice TESOL website. There's lots there, and membership, join. That's all I can say. Anything that Monica, the president, wants to say to us?
I just want to encourage Lauren, but also anyone else who's attending to consider submitting a proposal for our annual conference. Our call for proposals is open this month. And if you've never presented at a conference before, it's not intimidating. It can be very casual. It can be a teaching tip. Lauren, I hope you join us for the conference. And, it can be something very practical. I think sometimes there's the preconceived notion that conference presentations need to be very formal, but we have categories like teaching tips. So if there's something that you would like to share with colleagues, fellow teachers at our conference, we're having a virtual day, and we're, fingers crossed, trying to have some in-person time as well in White Plains. But when you submit your proposal, you can let us know if you're comfortable only presenting virtually or in person, or either or, and then we'll just be, a little flexible leading up to the conference. So please consider, submitting something. We want it to be a collaborative time. So we want everyone's input, everyone to take part in the conference. Thank you so much, Lauren, and everyone, for being here.
I'll also just add my first conference that I ever presented at was 3 years ago at New York State TESOL on TPRS. And
Yay!
I was really nervous.
I remember.
But it was 15 minutes, and 15 minutes it's a really good like starting point, and everybody is there to learn. And also, if you're not a member of New York State TESOL at this point, you really should be. There's so many resources. I've like lost count of them this year. So.
Yeah, I also want to say, the great thing is it's just so practical. You just get so many ideas like today, but just, because we always think sometimes these conferences can get a little bit like papers and we're being read to, but actually, no, you have ideas straight that you can implement in your classroom, which I think is really important. Well, thank you, Lauren. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much. Have a lovely evening, and we'll see you at the next event, which is probably tomorrow. Bye.